Welcome to the second webinar of the gCMEp practice group. I am Monica Ghidinelli and I work for the AO Foundation, where my main responsibilities are accreditation and medical education research. Today I'm going to discuss with Celeste Kolanko and Sophie Wilson about how to develop accredited continuing medical education. And without any further ado, I would like Sophie and Celeste to introduce themselves. I would start with Sophie, please.
Hello all, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I'm Sophie Wilson. I work for International Medical Press, a provider of independent and accredited medical education, and I've been working at IMP for over 17 years, and before that I worked in medical education, medcoms, traditional medcoms. I'll hand over to Celeste.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Monica, and welcome to everybody. And thanks for joining us today on what's a very hot day here in the UK. I'm Celeste Kolanko. I'm the Managing Director of Liberum IME. Like Sophie, Liberum, we do independent and accredited medical education. All of our education is grant funded. I have been working in the IME, CME world, both in the United States and then for the last 8 years over in Europe for over 20 years now. And my previous career was in education as well. And Liberum IME, just like the AO Foundation and IMP, are proud members of the gCMEp practice group.
Thank you, Sophie and Celeste. So as you heard, we are part of the gCMEp practice group that has 4 core principles that can be applied to create good accredited education. So these 4 principles are appropriateness, transparency, balance, and effectiveness. So in our view, the most important aspects to create good educational activities are that the education is appropriate and effective. But before you start designing education that is appropriate and effective, you need to ensure that this is transparent and balanced. So let's start with those 2 principles. Celeste, can you please talk about what do you mean about transparency and how you apply it to your education when you develop it?
Thanks, Monica. I think, transparency, and to your point, I think there are 4 core principles that the gCMEp practice group adhere by. But I do believe that some are just mandatory, as we spoke of, and then the others really enhance what we're trying to do. Transparency is really just a basic underlying piece that all of our education needs to be transparent in that it has to reveal the sources of funding. This has to be open to the public. This is not promotional. There are no logos that company logos that sit on any of our content. We want to make sure that all of our content experts, all of our faculty, everyone who's involved, declare what their conflict of interests are, if they have any. So basically, if somebody comes as a learner to the program, they should be able to say, Monica, has been part of this program, and I see, if she has any conflicts of interest or not. Occasionally, conflicts will arise, and it's important to have a very strong resolution policy to make sure you have that in place. And that can be a variety of different things. Obviously, peer review or multiple peer review being the gold standard of that. But it's really, really important that our education is independent. So we have to let everybody know where this is coming from. And right from the very beginning, we want to gain trust with our learners, and transparency is a huge portion of that.
Thank you, Celeste. So that's clear. Conflict of interest, the source of fundings need to be put up front for the participants before they even register, correct? So they know exactly which piece of education you will provide. So Sophie, can you tell us about what is balance and how you do that in your education?
Thank you, Monica. I think the important thing to remember is, why are we doing CME? We're doing CME to educate doctors so that they can improve outcomes for their patient. Every patient is different, and so a physician needs to know about all the therapies within the disease area, all the options that are available to them, not just the product, the agent that the particular supporter manufactures. So when we do CME, an independent medical education, we've got to talk about all the products in the disease area so that the physician can tailor to the best option for their specific patient. And really, that's what balance is about, is to make sure you cover the whole spectrum of medical strategies, of therapies in the area. I think that's really that's it in short.
Yes, and maybe also not having only one expert opinion, correct?
Well, I think you do that by designing your program so that you cover all the therapy areas, and yes, you will get expert opinion and advice from a number of different experts.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as mentioned, balance and transparency are the minimum that are required, and these are the basics for accredited medical education. And what we suggest, of course, is to have all the documents collected up front. So you, especially for the conflict of interest, because you need to know before the conflicts that are possibly involved in with your faculty or your experts, to be able to mitigate them and to don't have problems later on. But now let's go to the core of and to the most important and challenging aspects in designing medical education, so to make it appropriate and effective. Sophie, could you tell us how you go about designing appropriate education?
I think, again, it comes back to the patient. You need to, when you're designing a medical program, education program, you need to start with where are the gaps for the patient? What isn't being treated? And then when you've identified the gap in a specific therapy area, you can then work backwards and say, okay, well, to improve patient outcomes, we need to address this and that educational need. And so you then need to look at, well, what do doctors need to be doing differently to address that gap in the patient's management? And when you're looking at it, it may be that there is a new therapy in a particular area. In that case, you may need to educate about knowledge. You need to be able to raise awareness and knowledge of new treatment strategies. But the education might be a skills-based education. It may be that people simply don't know how to implement their new knowledge or how to implement new guidelines. Well, having a symposium that lectures about that how to do is not really going to educate. So you need to, in that scenario, you need to develop a program that allows people to learn new skills and to apply new skills. Some of your gaps may be systems gaps, in which case, do you know what? We feel we don't really know. We're not in a position to address a systems gap. That may be policy or lobbying. So really, once you've identified the gap in what the patient needs, you need to work backwards and work out what can you change in how doctors do. And doctors need to be willing to change. So there's a lot of behavioural change, science going on there as well. And once you've done that and worked out, is your gap motivational? Is your gap systems? Is it knowledge, or is it attitudinal? You can then design your program, and you've then done your needs assessment properly, and you've then also got to think about, you know, your target audience. Are you targeting young doctors who may work online? Are you targeting more traditional doctors, or in doctors in areas where perhaps there isn't as much IT? You know, you've got to think about all these things when you do your needs assessment, not just about what your supporter might want to hear. It's about what the doctor needs to improve patient outcomes.
Thank you, Sophie. But so then after you do your needs assessment, you decide what is your target audience. You need also to define your learning objectives based on the skill, attitude or knowledge. But how can you translate these pieces in effective education? Celeste, can you please talk about this?
Sure. So, I agree with everything that Sophie had said. I think it's very easy for us to think about. And traditionally, I think education, especially here in Europe, when I came over here about 8 years ago, most of the independent or CME or accredited materials were really led by someone saying, hey, I think that's a good idea. Someone needs to learn that. And, what do we want to learn? Okay, we want to sit people in a room. We want them to come to a meeting. The term in the UK is bums in seats. That was something that was new for me, being over here. But really, it was just attendance. Do people come and hear what you're talking about? And to Sophie's point, the target audience, did it matter? Did, that they were getting the right education? Was this something that was going to be valuable that they could, ultimately use to improve their patient care? And, the Moore's levels of outcomes, which have been around since the mid-90s and had been adopted pretty much in the American model of CME and through the ACCME, was starting to really pick up and make sense over here to providers and accreditors over here in Europe. And they are the 7 different levels, starting everywhere from level 1 participation. So basically, did I show up? Did I come to that meeting? Did I say I was going to come? Did I come and sit and listen to somebody talk to me for an hour or whatever? Okay, that's level 1. Level 2 is satisfaction. Did you enjoy the meeting? Did you think it was useful? And that's also something that you want to truly measure. But that was where kind of the evaluation really stopped. Did you come? Did you like it? Once we get into level 3, Moore's levels, now we're talking about a knowledge gain. Did I actually learn something from this? And as Sophie pointed out, understanding what your gap is, understanding what that educational need is in the beginning is how you're going to decide what type of measurement, and did somebody gain knowledge, and what ways can you do a knowledge understanding, if somebody learned something. Pre and post test is something that's obviously very normally done in any kind of education setting, not just in IME or CME. What did you know beforehand? What did you learn afterwards? And that is an effective way of looking at knowledge. When we get into level 4, we're talking about competence. So I learned something, but now can I actually know how to use it? So asking questions like surrogate cases and saying, okay, you've learned about all this information. Now you have this patient here. What would you do in that practice, in that situation? And having people be able to tell you what they're going to do. Sometimes that's answering some multiple choice questions. Sometimes it's free form, asking people to write what they have learned, self-reflection. When we get into level 5 is performance. And at a performance level, you want to see that somebody has actually taken something that they've learned and put it into action. So what have they done with that? What have I learned at this either a CME event, this accredited online learning piece, a variety of different types of ways to do this. How have I put this into practice? What has this done? How have I used this? The final levels are patient health and community health, and looking if your activity has actually changed. Patient health has actually changed community health, and I'll be very honest, those levels are very difficult to obtain unless you're working on a very large term project and you're doing a lot of analysis and tracking and those types of things. But we've moved away from just saying, I went to an event, here's a survey, here's a satisfaction survey. I thought it was interesting. I liked the speaker. To actually, what are we going to do with this, with what we've learned? And sometimes it is definitely, it can be as simple as a pre-test, post-test, but we have to going back to what Sophie said, we have to start from the very beginning. Where is the gap? How are patients not being served? What do we need to do to make sure that our education bridges those gaps and addresses that particular need? And, if there's a new therapeutic that's come out and it's first in its class, sometimes knowledge is what you need. You need for people to be aware and learn about something, a new mechanism of action. Sometimes we need to know that they have the capability to actually use this information. And then sometimes we want to make sure that they are putting it into practice. And again, we learn all this stuff. It keeps going back to that whole needs assessment process, to the whole, appropriateness. Is this the right education for this particular group? And then we marry that up with how we're going to measure it. And we do all of this in the very, very beginning. I mean, Sophie, I think you would agree with me. You don't think about how you're going to evaluate this after you've decided on your program. You're thinking about how you're going to evaluate this when you're going through your needs assessment process, when you're designing your program, when you're getting into that instructional design phase. That's when you think about, how you're going to be effective, how you're going to measure this. So, it's great to have education out there and give information. And there's all different kinds. And we're seeing today, especially with the pandemic, physicians' time is spread. People are starting to learn differently. They want to access education differently. But we still have to think about some way of measuring, are they actually benefiting from this? And ultimately, our goal is ultimately to make sure that patient health care is much better.
Thank you, Celeste. So we have some questions coming through the Q&A, but I would start with this one. Sophie, please. What challenges do you find in developing independent CME?
I think one of the big challenges is that people don't know what they don't know. And I think Celeste touched on it, is that, we need to really find out what the true educational need is, not just rely on hearsay or on what the supporter wants to support. It's got to be, people don't know what they need to learn because they don't know what they don't know. And what they don't know is what they need to be learning. It's a bit of a vicious circle. And that's the big challenge, is really pinpointing what people need to learn so that we can improve patient outcomes. And that's really where providers such as ourselves, but members of the gCME practice group, come in, because we may not all be physicians. Many of us, we have a lot of physician consultants, but we're educators. And as educators, we can partner with societies, with doctors, to develop the best the best approach to learning and to filling the educational gaps. And I think the challenge there is that often doctors and our supporters seem to think they know what needs to be educated about, but they're not always educators. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's about identifying what doctors truly need to learn. And often that's motivational.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sophie. I have another question that is about if there is a mechanism in which this participant is asking if there is a mechanism in which they can replicate the CME modeling in other countries. This participant is from India, where seems to be the pharma hub and the number of doctors. And yes, so do you think that this model will be applicable in other countries?
I'm happy to start on that. I think that, knowing that, and to be fair, Sophie can address this as well. She was one of the first people to start the gCME practice group about 12 years ago over here in Europe, because there was a scene for a need of change. I think that this model of what we've developed in gCME practice group can work in other countries and other areas. And I do think that it really does take groups of like-minded individuals getting together to really formulate what they want to see happening from an accredited or an independent education. A lot of times it means getting, possibly governmental bodies, healthcare system bodies on track. It's not necessarily an easy situation, but I will say that there are groups from a variety of different countries, the accreditation bodies in Europe, which are both, we've got the European, EACME, we've got the local accreditation country bodies, there is the gCMEp in the United States, there's the Canadian colleges and their systems. And I think all of these different groups are very willing, it's been my experience that they'll share their information with you. I can't really make sure that, I can't say that you're going to want to do it the same way in India, because you always have to make sure that, it fits what the cultural norms are. It fits what works with your healthcare systems. But I think the overall principles that we're talking about, these 4 core principles of good CME practice, can certainly be applied to anywhere in the world. And you do have to take your local considerations into consideration. Sophie, do you want to add anything onto that?
No, I think it's about getting together with other providers in your area and working together so that you can help build a solid CME foundation that works within your culture and the way doctors in your country work. So, yeah.
Yeah, agree. And so we will have also this type of discussion on. We will run a dedicated session at the 14th Annual European CME Forum. So there, probably we will continue the discussion on how this can be applied to different systems, because of course the Good CME Practice Group is European focus, but the principles can be used specifically can be transposed to other parts. Of course, taking in consideration the background in which that is. So we have another question regarding the conflict of interest declarations. So what is the best way to do this declaration?
Shall I take that?
Yes, Sophie.
Monica, thank you.
Yes.
So conflict of interest declarations there are many ways of doing it. And I think the most important thing is when you set up your program and you identify your target audience, your target learners, you also then need to work out, do you want it to be accredited by gCMEp, which is what we mainly do in Europe, but also gCMEp if it's more of an international audience? Because a lot of the accreditors, or EBAC, for example, in Europe, a lot of the accreditors have their own conflict of interest form because they like to be able to assess your application fairly and in a balanced fashion compared to all their other activities. So the first thing probably is, once you've worked out who you think you should be applying for accreditation, if they have a form, use that form. But the most important thing from my perspective is you should be doing this at the start of your activity when you are inviting your faculty, because you should be getting their conflict of interest form before you actually get involved with them. Because you might find, if you leave it as a bit of paperwork to the end, and you leave it to the end, you then might find that actually they have a conflict, and you want to know that before you can mitigate it, so that you can mitigate it. Because if you wait for the accreditor to come back and say, well, there's a conflict of interest, it will be too late. So the most important thing is you can collect conflicts of interest in many different ways. Accreditors have their own form, some providers have their own form. Work it out up front according to your accreditor, your target audience, and get that conflict of interest form and look at it and check it before you actually get deep down into the program.
Okay, so I would just add 2 comments. One thing is that you can do also it automatically in the invitation email when you invite this person to the event, and who should declare everyone involved in the development of the education. So even the educator themselves, so Celeste, Sophie, and I should declare the conflicts of interest. And then if you find, mitigate it. Now we have 3 minutes left. We have another question regarding accreditation. So if CME accreditation link with professional development for all the professions, and who recognize CME accreditation, is this for all the professions, or so also for pharmacists and so on? Who would like to take?
I'll take that
1 minute.
quickly. So yeah, so bottom line is, normally most of the accrediting bodies are for physicians. There are some bodies that will accredit for other professions, and some of them are reciprocal with the credit. If you have the physician credit, you can use it if you're a pharmacist or you're a nurse. But bottom line, it definitely is, it's all situational, depends on country, depends on accrediting body.
Yeah, exactly. And in Europe, we have different accreditors that are specific for different professions, not like in the US where you have the gCMEp that maybe you have multi-professional accreditation. Correct. So now we have 1 minute. So I would like to thank you all for participating in this webinar. Thank you, Sophie and Celeste. And I wish you all the participants a good rest of the day. Thank you.